there's really a very impressive amount of research behind both papers, and really interesting research as well. And I want to take a moment to appreciate how challenging it is always to conduct this kind of ethnographic research, and how much more challenging it must have been to do so in the context of a pandemic. So I want to congratulate the authors for this significant accomplishment. And I also want to commend them for the thoughtfulness that they brought to each paper. And I'm going to highlight two common threads. I just want to flag them for you now in my comments. And I always view my job as a commentator to be a little bit critical to, with the eye to making the papers better, right? So it's kind of boring if I just to only tell you everything I like. I want to try and be constructive and give you a path forward. So along that vein, I think, one common thread that you're going to hear me talk a little bit about is that both papers kind of have an assumption that religion matters. In that they are looking at how religion matters for IHL compliance. But there's a way in which I think you can read both papers as actually questioning whether or how much religion matters for IHL compliance. And I think that this is worth thinking about, both for these papers and perhaps also for the broader project. And then another thread that is common to both of these papers is that they are wrestling with extremism. And how and whether extremism fits with the analysis of the relationship between religion and compliance with international humanitarian law. And, as someone who also works in this space, I very much sympathize with this challenge. This is a problem that many, many scholars have tried to solve, and I don't feel like we've been all that successful. But I do think it's important to be explicit about how we are thinking about extremism, and in particular, you don't need to come up with your own definition, but I think you want to be upfront about how you're identifying extremists ex ante. And again, because I think this is very much wrapped up in popular discourse around religion and IHL compliance, especially when we're talking about Islam, which is the religion that both of these papers address. All right, so let me start with Ella's paper, The Influence of Women Religious Actors in Enhancing International Humanitarian Compliance in Jordan. I'm not going to summarize the paper because Ella did a fantastic job presenting it. But I want to say that there are, I think, a lot of really fascinating threads in this paper. I especially appreciated the gendered analysis. I think that the exploration of women's role in Islam in Jordan is really important. And it's quite a creative take, I thought, to focus on a state that produces foreign fighters rather than one that is itself mired in internal conflict, and I think provides a lot of really interesting opportunities. I do wonder, though, whether the two questions framing the paper, the role of women on one hand and the role of religion and religious institutions on the other, might mean that this might work better as two separate papers. But let me just pose some questions that the paper raised for me. So one question that I had when reading the paper, but I think Ella in the presentation kind of addressed this to some extent, but I still want to flag it for her, is the stage at which you, Ella, expect influence from women as religious leaders, and how might this influence differ across stages? So in the talk you mentioned the foundational stage of norm recruitment, but other stages like recruitment, targeting or participation, demobilization or de-radicalization are also alluded to in the paper, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about those. You also discussed, Ella, the importance of highlighting the compatibility of Islam with international humanitarian law. And while, of course, the non-hierarchical structure of Islam makes settling on an authoritative interpretation challenging, there is, I would argue, a great deal of overlap between what we might think of as public international humanitarian law or Western international humanitarian law, that tradition, and Islamic humanitarian law. And I think you can stipulate that to some extent. You end up arguing that the key role of women occurs at this foundational moment of norm formulation. And you mentioned, for example, that one of the participants highlighted the importance of learning Islamic humanitarian law at school. And here I would love to see more about the content just to my previous point about the substantive overlap between different traditions in humanitarian law. So what was the content, or what do you see as the content of Islamic humanitarian law that people are learning in school? And then a thread, again, running throughout is how you deal with extremist groups in this context. And I wanted, again, to hear more on that. From a policy perspective, you argue for institutionalizing Islamic education more, but you also point to government crackdowns on religious organizations for fear of extremism. And I came away wondering how you reconcile these tensions as a matter of policy.
Yeah.
And then one last question is that you find that women religious leaders are especially influential vis-a-vis women and girls. And it struck me that there's an interesting opportunity here to think about how this finding might intersect with the role of female fighters in Islamic identifying armed non-state actors. And then so finally, and this is the point I was making earlier, you ask at the start whether the structure of female religious actors in Jordan affects their ability to influence, and whether religious actors have the power and or capacity to influence compliance with IHL in Jordan. And I think that the answer to both questions is probably it depends. And while you offer some answers on what it depends on, I would urge you to explore these nuances further. All right, okay, I'm taking more time than I meant to. So let me turn now to Hasna and Ioanna's paper. Again, I'm not gonna summarize, but I'll offer some comments. So let me say first that not knowing anything myself about Madkhali Salafism and not being a specialist in Libya, I learned a great deal from this paper, and I really appreciate your embrace of the complex political and religious landscape in Libya right now. But my main comment is actually one that Hasna kind of alluded to in framing the paper, which is that by exposing all of the internal contradictions of Madkhali Salafism, it ends up, this strain of Salafism ends up seeming like an empty vessel. In other words, its malleability seems to leave it without doctrine, which is foundational to religion. That's how we think about religion. So if its quietist nature can be used to support violence, and its insistence on allegiance or obedience to a leader can be used to support any leader, then how much content does Madkhali Salafism really have in this particular context? In other words, it seems to be deployed so strategically that it lacks any consistent structure. And this point leads me to another question or concern. Again, one of the threads that I flagged for you that I would focus on, which is, what if there is little to no relationship between religion on one hand and compliance with IHL in this conflict? I worry a bit that you're trying to force a connection without acknowledging that such a connection might not exist. And so, here it would be helpful, although I concede a great deal of work to compare Madkhali Salafist groups to groups that are subscribing to other religious traditions or other religions. Do we observe differences in behavior that fall along religious lines? Ultimately, I'm not sure that you answer the question that you pose on page 7, which is whether non-compliance with humanitarian norms is traceable to the influence of Madkhali religious leaders. But I thought that where the paper is most interesting is in the discussion of authority grounded in Weber. And I wondered whether the authority of Madkhali religious leaders is simply a function of them being religious leaders rather than a function of them being leaders of a particular religion. And so the last specific comment I'll make on this paper is that I agree very much with what Hasna said at the end, which is, refers to the importance of localism. I suspect that in this context, imperatives that refer to politics, governance, and strategy end up being the most consequential when we're talking about compliance with IHL. So let me just wrap up again by congratulating these authors, but returning to this point about and really trying to push you a little bit about not assuming a relationship between religion and compliance with IHL, because I do think it's important to attend to the politics here. And another way to phrase this would be to ask, under what conditions do religious actors or religion, under what conditions does religion condition compliance with IHL? All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. The one question is a procedural question about whether you can find whether the papers are available. And I'm going to let one of the organizers of the conference address that question. So let me just, in that case, since we have about 5 minutes left, ask Ella and Hasna if they wanted to respond to each other's papers or respond to other comments.
Actually, I can respond to a comment. Actually, thank you, Tanisha. Actually, you're right. Like we have been discussing as a group within the General Respects Project of this relationship that maybe religious leaders might not be the only actor who has a role there, especially in Libya. Then throughout my interviews and discussing with other stakeholders, we noticed that maybe we can have another actor who are the tribal leaders, actually, who might influence more given the nature of the Libyan society. So it's on a later stage that we are actually mapping the different tribal leaders. Actually, there are many in Libya, you cannot imagine, and their potential role, which I'm sure they have a great deal within the IHL. So point taken, it's not really a focus on religious leaders, but we are also considering that other actors might also play a role within this. Then maybe I leave Ella the floor.
Yeah, just to sort of talk about that, actually, about the our religious leaders. The big influences is like, do they have a big capacity to do this? I think in Jordan, I don't think they are doing it to a significant extent, but I think what the research has highlighted is the potential power and capacity they have to do that, especially the women. And I think as well, with the influence of the religious institutes, the children are going there every week and throughout the school holidays from the ages of 8 to 14. That's a huge influence that these female teachers are having. And, if we can have some kind of discussion and dialogue with them about the similarities with IHL and the values, then I think that it could have a huge impact, especially with religious teachers in schools as well, with influencing people to not then subsequently become radicalized by these ideas. And I think a lot of the participants have said to me that, anyone who's going to join these groups and believes these justifications that these groups are providing, they don't know the true values of Islam. This is what everyone has said to me. And they don't have this basic foundation of Islamic education. It's not there. So I think there is real potential for that to happen, and that for these religious actors to have a greater influence than they do now in respect to compliance.
Ella, can I just ask, sort of along those, just to follow up on what you're saying then, do you have a sense of either the content or the variation in content of the kind of religious education that the women who you're studying are offering? Because it seems like that's really where you could get a lot of leverage on this.
I think with reference to the specific content, I haven't got specific information on specifically what's being taught, but when I've spoke to a lot of youth and a lot of female youth and asked them about what is being said and are they learning, the Islamic values of war and things like that, and they're saying that they are being taught this in schools and also in the religious centres. But it's to the extent I need to do more research into it. And one of the biggest difficulties of this whole project, actually, because of the sensitivity of the topic and the government crackdown, is trying to get religious teachers and the people from the institutes to talk, because they're really frightened. The intelligence services here are on really high alert about this. So it has actually been very difficult to get specifics on the actual content which is being taught. But I am trying still to get more information on that.
That's great.
Make
Yeah.
you aware that this is being recorded. Sorry, just be careful.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you for that reminder.
Can I just jump in, Tanisha?
Please.
On a follow-up question that you asked, so the silent person comes comes to the table as well. I think it's a really, really good question, and thank you so much for your comments, and we'll definitely look to address them. But the comment that you made, that you started with, that we assume a relationship between religious actors and compliance or non-compliance, I should say, with IHL. I think we're assuming it because we have evidence that there is a relationship. We have such clear evidence in the case of Libya that it's incredible. However, what is really, really important is that it's not the influence of religion, it's the influence of religious interpretations by certain actors, the legitimacy of whom is validated by armed actors. The reason why they validate their legitimacy may be religious ideology, but what we're actually finding out, it's not that. It's economic interest. It's other kind of interests that interact together. So the biggest mistake, I would say, that we could make is to essentialize religion as this is why they do this. This is why they do not comply with IHL. They use justifications put forward in fatwas not to comply with IHL or to target certain religious minorities. So we have that. But the reason why they do that, yes, there may be shared religious ideology, but there are so many other reasons, among which economic, political reasons, and indeed aspects relating to localism, communalism, and so on. Well, I think what's fascinating is that this localism and communalism these are aspects usually portrayed in the context of Libya as creating this chaos in institutions, and it's true. However, in this particular context of norm compliance and the examples we have, but we wouldn't generalize, it has functioned as a force limiting the negative influence of religious actors. So it's really interesting. It's local populations based on their ties with the armed groups that have had such a negative reaction to the fatwas that the armed groups had to pull back. So it's what I would say is stay away from essentializing the economic factor, stay away from essentializing the political factor, the local factor, as well as the religious factor. One doesn't explain everything, and it's their interaction that is interesting. Yeah.
So we're a little bit over time. Can we chat for another minute or two? Okay, so I just wanted to push you a little bit and say that on a few fronts. So first, let me just underline again that I really appreciate the your embrace of the complexity of the case. And I especially liked the way that Hasna framed this puzzle at the beginning, which is, you have these rival groups that are apparently subscribing to the same religious tradition, but they're rival groups, so how do we reconcile that? It strikes me that without really knowing anything about this particular tradition, right? So this is a little bit of a shot in the dark. But based on your paper, I wonder if one way that you can reconcile that, or one contribution to reconciling that, is this focus within Madkhali Salafism of on allegiance to the leader, right? That the specific role that the leader has allows that kind of dichotomy in terms of the landscape of the conflict. But I also want to push back a little bit. I mean, while recognizing that we don't want to essentialize specific factors, I always worry that if it's everything, right? If everything is the answer to the question, then it's nothing, right? And then it's really hard to figure out what to do with that, and it ends up being descriptive and not and I think there's a lot of value in description, but if you have to decide what the purpose of the work is. If it's purely descriptive, that's one thing, but my sense is that you want it to be at least as analytical as descriptive. And if that is the case, then there needs to be a clear takeaway. And again, if it's everything, then it's nothing.
I agree with you, but I think I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I think, however, if you look at this particular ideology, Kali ideology, in other contexts beyond Libya, you see the same tension. There is a tension between the two principles, an intrinsic tension that we were discussing with Hasna, and then we have many other religions and currents. It's an embedded flexibility that allows the religion to be applied in different ways in different contexts. We have that in law as well. It's a context sensitivity. So I agree with you. I think Hasna's and mine aim is to narrow down the factors that explain this relational influence, faithful to the reality, the empirical reality that we see, to narrow them down without essentializing any of them, and to help with that humanitarian organization considering whether is it actually worth to engage with religious leaders in this Kali current. Should we actually engage with them? What could we achieve, and what do we have to consider? What is it that motivates their fatwas, and what is it that convinces armed groups to validate this legitimacy, it seems, in certain instances, and not in others? So yeah, I guess that's where we're coming from. So we definitely want to go beyond description, but we don't want to force a conclusion that is not supportive, basically. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I endorse all of that, including what the aim of the paper is. And maybe another way to frame it is to use that language of narrowing it down. In which case, you can say, well, we can't necessarily tell you what it is, but maybe we can tell you what it isn't.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we just have the key to our paper. Brilliant. Thank you.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So with that, I want to, I hope we can all applaud. Is there a way to use the, no, there isn't a way to use the, so I'll just applaud Ella and Hasna and Yana for two really excellent papers and presentations. And thank you both for all this research. I look forward to seeing what comes next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tanisha, for your great comments and for chairing the session.
Yeah.
My pleasure. I wanted to just say, I know we're still online and people are here. I couldn't attend the earlier sessions partly because of the time difference. And I will try and attend the next session. I'm not sure I can. We have a little bit of an emergency with our house where there's a tree that's about to fall on it. So.
Oh my God.
So I have to leave the house and come to
Oh my God. Thank you so much for making it in such circumstances even more. So thank you.
Joanna, I have your email. I don't have Ella's email, and I have the comments written up that I'm happy to send to you. So Ella, I'm gonna put my email in the chat to you.
Okay.
Tanisha, you know what I'll do? I'll just send you all an email, and then we're all on the same page.
Okay. I also
and you'll have
my email to Ella. So either way, if I have people's emails, then I can email you the comments. All right. Has the rest of the conference been going well?
Yeah, really good, I think. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it was lovely to see you all. I'm sorry we can't be in person,
I
especially
know.
because.
Hopefully next year.
Oh my God. We'll see.
Yeah.
This feels never ending. All right.
Take care. Bye, Ella. It was a pleasure to see you. Thank you, Hasna.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Bye.